Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today we're going to be digging into some really interesting research on the JFK assassination.
It's a topic that just never seems to go away, does it?
It really doesn't. And I think, especially now in 2025, we're looking back at all this historical data,
Right.
and it almost seems like the more we learn, the less we actually know.
Exactly. The pieces just don't seem to fit the way we were told they did.
So we've got this compilation of investigations and research reports, all these different perspectives on the JFK assassination, and what they all seem to point to are these strange anomalies.
Yeah, and that's what I find so fascinating.
Where do we even begin? Like, how do we even approach this mountain of information?
Well, I think the key is to look at the big picture. Each individual anomaly on its own might not be that convincing.
Right.
But when you start to see the patterns, when you see all these strange coincidences and inconsistencies piling up,
Yeah.
the odds of it all being just random chance, well, they become pretty astronomical.
That's what makes conspiracy theories so compelling, right?
Exactly.
It's like our brains are wired to look for patterns and connections.
Right.
And when we see enough of them, well, we start to think there must be something more going on.
Exactly. And with the JFK assassination, there's definitely something more going on.
But we have to be careful. We can't just jump to conclusions, right?
Absolutely. We have to be objective. We have to look at the evidence.
Right. So where do we start with that?
Well, I think a good place to begin is with JFK himself, specifically a speech he gave back in 1961 to the American Newspaper Publishers Association.
Okay, I've heard of this speech. It's the one where he talks about secret societies, right?
That's the one. He actually warned about a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relied on covert means to achieve its goals.
Hold on, monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. That's pretty strong language coming from a sitting president. I mean, was he talking about the Soviets or, like, who was he referring to?
It's a good question. He was speaking more broadly about threats to democracy, both internal and external. Remember, this was the height of the Cold War, so there was a lot of fear and paranoia about communist infiltration.
Right.
But Kennedy was also becoming increasingly wary of forces within the U.S. government.
Really? Like who?
Well, he was particularly concerned about the growing power of the military-industrial complex.
Ah, yes, the military-industrial complex, that tangled web of defense contractors and politicians and military leaders.
Exactly. He worried that this complex was gaining too much influence, potentially pushing the country towards unnecessary wars for profit.
I could see how that might create some tension.
Oh, absolutely. And his concerns weren't limited to the military.
So, okay, let's talk about the CIA then.
All right.
The Bay of Pigs invasion, that whole fiasco must have put him at odds with the intelligence community.
It was a major turning point. Kennedy felt deeply misled by the CIA, believing they'd withheld crucial information about the invasion's likely failure.
He was furious, wasn't he?
He was livid. He even threatened to dismantle the agency, scatter it into 1,000 pieces.
Wow, he really went there.
He did, and to add fuel to the fire, he fired Alan Dulles, the CIA director at the time.
Oh, yeah, I remember that detail. But wait a minute, didn't Dulles end up on the Warren Commission?
He did.
The very commission tasked with investigating Kennedy's assassination.
It's a fact that's always struck me as a bit odd, too convenient.
It certainly raises questions about potential conflicts of interest, right?
Absolutely it does.
So we've got the CIA and the military establishment potentially on the list of those who might have had reason to, let's say, disagree with JFK's policies. But the research you shared also mentions the Federal Reserve. That's a whole other level of powerful, right?
Absolutely. And this is where one of the most persistent JFK conspiracy theories comes into play, Executive Order 1110.
Oh, yeah, Executive Order 1110. That's the one where Kennedy supposedly tried to take down the Fed. I've heard all sorts of crazy claims about that.
It's important to separate fact from fiction. The order itself didn't dismantle the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
But it did grant the Treasury Secretary more power to issue silver certificates.
Silver certificate?
Essentially a form of currency backed by silver, potentially lessening the Fed's control over the monetary system.
So not a complete takedown of the Fed, but maybe a power play, a way to assert more control over the nation's finances.
Exactly, and that could have ruffled some very powerful feathers in the world of finance.
Okay, so we've got the CIA, the military-industrial complex, and now the Federal Reserve. It's a pretty impressive list of potential adversaries. But there's more, right? This research goes even further afield.
It does. Remember, we're trying to understand why Kennedy might have been perceived as a threat by various powerful groups.
Okay, so let's talk about Vietnam then. Everyone knows that the war escalated dramatically after Kennedy's death. Was he actually planning on pulling out completely?
Well, there's evidence to suggest that was his intention. He signed NSAM 263, a document outlining plans to withdraw 1,000 military advisors from Vietnam by the end of 63, with a complete withdrawal by 65. This directly clashed with the military establishment's push for greater involvement.
So yet another powerful group, potentially at odds with Kennedy's vision. But hold on. If he was already planning to withdraw from Vietnam, What was the Gulf of Tonkin incident all about?
That's where things get even murkier. Declassified documents now suggest that the incident, which was used to justify escalating the war, was at best exaggerated and at worst a deliberate fabrication.
Wait, you're telling me the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the whole thing that led to the massive U.S. troop buildup in Vietnam, might have been a lie?
It's a very real possibility, and it fits a pattern we're seeing. Kennedy was deeply suspicious of covert operations and manipulations of the truth, especially when it came to justifying military action.
And this brings us back to his 1961 speech, his warnings about conspiracies operating in the shadows. You have to admit, it's all starting to feel a bit less like a conspiracy theory and more like a chilling premonition.
Indeed. And speaking of chilling premonitions, there's another document that sheds light on the potential dangers Kennedy faced, Operation Northwoods.
Operation Northwoods, what's it?
It was a plan, thankfully never implemented, developed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It involved staging attacks on U.S. soil, blaming them on Cuba, and using that as a pretext for a full-scale invasion.
You're kidding, right? They were seriously considering attacking their own citizens to justify a war.
It's all there in the declassified documents. The plan included proposals for sinking U.S. ships, hijacking planes, even simulating terrorist attacks in American cities.
That's insane. I mean, what kind of thinking goes into something like that?
It speaks to a mindset that saw any means as justifiable to achieve their desired ends. And remember, this plan was presented to President Kennedy, who thankfully rejected it outright.
Wow, so we've got the CIA, the military, the Fed. Who else did Kennedy manage to make powerful enemies of during his short time in office?
Well, there's one more we need to address. It's a sensitive subject, but it's crucial to understand the full scope of Kennedy's challenges. We need to talk about Israel.
Okay, this should be interesting. I know Kennedy had a complicated relationship with Israel, especially when it came to their nuclear ambitions.
He was deeply opposed to Israel developing nuclear weapons, believing it would destabilize the entire Middle East. He pushed for international inspections of their Dimona reactor, which was suspected of being part of a covert nuclear program.
And how did Israel react to this pressure?
They resisted strongly. They saw nuclear capability as essential for their security, and they weren't willing to compromise.
And after Kennedy's assassination?
Lyndon B. Johnson took a much softer stance, essentially allowing Israel to develop its nuclear program unimpeded.
Okay, so we've got a potential conflict with Israel added to the mix. But we haven't even touched on the assassination itself, the evidence, the inconsistencies, the grassy knoll, all that.
We'll get there. But first, it's crucial to establish why Kennedy might have been perceived as a threat. The more you understand the forces he was up against, the more the events of November 22nd, 1963 start to make a different kind of sense.
All right, I'm ready to dive into the details of that fateful day, but I think we need to pause here for a second and let all this sink in. Because honestly, even I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by the sheer number of potential players in this story.
A good point. We've covered a lot of ground. It's important to let these connections, these potential motives, resonate before we move on to the events in Dallas.
We'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into the JFK assassination.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about all these powerful groups that JFK might have alienated during his presidency. It's no wonder the events of that day in Dallas continue to fascinate and puzzle people.
It's like a political thriller. You know, you've got this young, charismatic president challenging the status quo, taking on these powerful institutions, and then boom, he's gone.
And that's why we need to examine the details of the assassination itself, because if you go beyond the lone gunman theory, you start to find all these anomalies, these things that just don't add up.
All right, let's talk about the Zapruder film then. It's iconic. Everyone's seen it, that grainy 8mm footage of the motorcade. What makes it so crucial to understanding what really happened?
Well, for one thing, it provides a visual record of the shooting. And there are details in that footage that contradict the Warren Commission's findings. Take, for instance, the backward snap of Kennedy's head after the fatal shot.
Yeah, that head snap has always been a major point of contention, hasn't it?
It has. The official narrative claims that all the shots came from the rear, from the Texas School Book Depository, but the way Kennedy's head snaps back and to the left suggests a shot from the front. Maybe from the grassy knoll.
So the direction of the head snap raises questions about where the shots came from. But there's more to the Zapruder film than just that, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's the question of the shooting sequence itself. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald fired 3 shots in roughly 5.5 seconds, 1 miss and 2 hits. But even expert marksmen have had trouble replicating that feat using the same type of rifle Oswald allegedly used.
And this has led a lot of people to believe there might have been a second shooter.
It's a theory that's hard to dismiss, and when you factor in other oddities in the film, like the lack of reaction from Abraham Zapruder himself, the man who was filming, it just deepens the mystery.
Oh, what do you mean lack of reaction?
Well, imagine you're filming a parade and suddenly the president is shot right in front of you. You'd expect some kind of startled movement, wouldn't you? A gasp, a jump, something. But Zapruder remains remarkably steady, almost as if he was expecting it to happen.
Now that you mention it, that is kind of strange. It's almost like he knew what was about to happen. I know there have been all sorts of theories about Zapruder's role, some even suggesting he was in on the conspiracy.
We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions, but it's definitely a detail that warrants further scrutiny. And speaking of details that raise eyebrows, there's the whole issue of JFK's missing brain.
Hold on, his brain went missing. How is that even possible? How does a president's brain just disappear?
It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. After the autopsy, JFK's brain was stored in the National Archives, but in 1966, it vanished without a trace.
And this missing brain has just fueled even more conspiracy theories, right?
Of course, the brain with its bullet fragments would have been crucial evidence in determining the trajectory of the shots and potentially confirming or refuting the single-shooter theory. Its disappearance, whether accidental or deliberate, just adds to the cloud of suspicion around the whole investigation.
Okay, so we've got the Zapruder film, the missing brain, the inconsistencies in the shooting sequence. What about the Secret Service? They were supposed to be protecting the president. Were there any anomalies in their behavior that day?
Oh, plenty. Let's start with the motorcade route itself. It went right past the Texas School Book Depository, a building that provided a clear line of sight for a potential shooter.
You'd think they would have picked a more secure route, right?
You would, and then there's the decision to remove the bubble top from Kennedy's limousine. It was a beautiful day, and they wanted the crowds to have a clear view of the president, but it also made him a much easier target.
It seems like a pretty reckless decision in hindsight, especially given the political climate at the time.
It does, and the oddities don't stop there. After the shots were fired, the Secret Service agents didn't immediately cover the president or rush him to safety. Some of them seemed confused, disoriented, almost like they weren't expecting an assassination attempt.
Okay, now that is really concerning. You'd think they would be highly trained and ready to react in a split second.
Exactly, and there's this one detail that's always baffled researchers. One agent, Roy Kellerman, who was in the front seat of the limo, actually jumped onto the back of the car after the shots were fired.
Why would he do that? Was he trying to shield the president?
It's unclear. Some people think he was trying to assess the situation, others say he was trying to help. But it's just a bizarre move. It goes against all standard Secret Service protocol.
It's almost like they were following a different set of rules that day, like they were working from a script that didn't account for a real assassination attempt.
It's a disturbing thought, but it's one we can't just dismiss, because when you put these inconsistencies and anomalies on top of everything else we've talked about, it paints a very different picture than the one presented by the Warren Commission.
Yeah, it's starting to feel less like a lone gunman and more like some kind of orchestrated conspiracy. But who would even have the power and the motive to pull something like this off?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll explore in more detail after a quick break. Stick with us as we continue our deep dive into the JFK assassination.
So we've spent all this time talking about the evidence that suggests the official narrative of JFK's assassination might be, I don't know, incomplete.
Incomplete. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. We've seen how JFK challenged some very powerful groups both within the U.S. government and internationally. And we've seen how the evidence surrounding his assassination is riddled with inconsistencies and unanswered questions.
So let's get to the heart of it. If we entertain the idea of a conspiracy, who are we talking about here? Who had the means and the motive to kill a president?
Well, let's go back to those groups you discussed earlier. First, you have elements within the CIA, Kennedy's attempts to control the agency, his threat to dismantle it that could have created some powerful enemies within that world.
And let's not forget about Alan Dulles, the CIA director that Kennedy fired. He ended up on the Warren Commission. That's got to raise some red flags.
It does. It really does. It makes you question whether the investigation was truly objective, whether there were conflicts of interest at play.
Okay, so the CIA is on the table. What about the Federal Reserve? Could a bunch of bankers really have orchestrated the assassination of a president?
It's a bold claim, I know, but we're talking about an institution with incredible power over the global financial system. If Kennedy was perceived as a threat to their interests, well, they certainly had the resources to take him out.
And we don't necessarily have to imagine this huge coordinated effort. It could have been a small group, a handful of individuals who felt threatened enough to act.
Exactly. And then you have the military-industrial complex. Kennedy's decision to withdraw troops from Vietnam would have been a major blow to their profits and influence. Plus, we've seen with Operation Northwoods that some within the military were willing to consider extreme measures to achieve their goals.
Yeah, Operation Northwoods is a chilling reminder of that. And it's scary to think that a president who wanted peace could be seen as more of a threat than an enemy nation.
It really highlights the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths some will go to hold on to it. And we can't forget about Israel either. Kennedy's opposition to their nuclear program, his insistence on international inspections that put him at odds with a nation that felt its very survival was at stake.
And we saw how quickly U.S. policy towards Israel shifted after Kennedy was gone.
Exactly. It's a detail we can't ignore. Of course, pinning the assassination on any one of these groups would be overly simplistic.
Right. It's probably more complicated than that.
Exactly. It's more likely a convergence of interests. A number of powerful groups that saw Kennedy as a threat to their agendas. You have the CIA worried about losing its autonomy, the Fed concerned about its financial dominance, the military-industrial complex wanting to escalate the war in Vietnam, and Israel determined to secure its nuclear future.
Wow. So it's like this perfect storm of opposition, all directed at one man.
And when you factor in the evidence surrounding the assassination itself, the inconsistencies, the cover-ups, the missing evidence, it becomes harder and harder to believe that it was just a random act of violence.
So where does that leave us? Are we just stuck speculating forever about what really happened that day in Dallas?
Not necessarily. We may never have definitive proof, but that doesn't mean we should stop searching for answers. New evidence continues to surface, and with each new revelation, the official story loses a little more credibility.
So what could we as individuals do to uncover the truth?
Stay informed, challenge the official narrative, demand transparency from those in power. Support the researchers and journalists who are bravely digging deeper, piecing together the puzzle.
Because at the end of the day, the truth about JFK's assassination isn't just about history. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world, the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of holding those in power accountable.
It's a story that reminds us to be vigilant, to question everything, to never stop searching for answers, no matter how uncomfortable they may be.
That's a great point. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the JFK assassination. It's been a fascinating but also a sobering look at a pivotal moment in history.
It certainly has.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, and remember, keep questioning, keep exploring, keep diving deep.